That was fighting for gay rights, and people were killed.
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
Nobody was killed.
This is a picture of RuPaul as a baby being held by his mother. Mrs. Ernestine always knew that her brand new baby boy was going to grow up to be a star. So he needed a special name that nobody else was going to have. Hence the name RuPaul.
Look at all of that I have to go. Look at all of that I have to go. I'm going to stand right here so you can get it all set.
So I got all the pictures.
You got all the pictures of what?
From the,
Y'all childhood pictures?
Mm-hmm.
And you put it on there?
Mm-hmm.
You got to be ignorant. You know that?
I am.
What are you doing?
Well, I'm just putting some, extra stuff on.
I know you ain't putting me with this shit on.
No, it's not even on the camera. I'm just looking through it.
All mothers think that their kids are the next best thing. But for her to name her child something that was good enough to be branded on if he somehow became famous proves to me that the level of confidence that RuPaul had throughout the decades of his career were thanks to the genes passed down to him by his mom, who always knew best. Now, I know that the legacy of Ru's franchise is great, but for today's video, I think it would be really significant for us to focus on the periods of RuPaul's life before Drag Race that don't get talked about as much. As always, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, follow me on Twitter at GreenGayYT, and make sure to follow my brand new Instagram and TikTok at It's Green Gay. Now, back to the video. A lot of people still get shook when they find out that RuPaul was in fact friends with a lot of queens that ended up competing on his show, which I guess makes sense when, to some people, drag didn't exist before 2009. But yes, there's decades worth of drag communities that all had their own little storylines with each other. Sadly, most records that focused on the drag communities of the past are hard to find, so we have to rely on word of mouth sources or the few documentaries that exist from those time periods. I wonder what it would be like if Drag Race had happened in the 1980s. We would have had a pretty key understanding of many figures during that era. Then again, I guess that's how people 30 years from now will be looking at all of the Drag Race content that we have right now in the same way. But anyways, I'd like to consider the different eras of RuPaul's life as the following. The first decade of his life was the 1960s, but it was really the 1970s that shaped the base of Ru as a person. This was the decade where she reached her teenage years, ran away from home, found her queer identity, but most importantly, was dead set on making something meaningful out of her life. There's not a lot that we know about Ru's early childhood years. On one hand, she mentions that her family provided her a very supportive environment where she was able to flourish. Yet, there seemed to be some obstacles present to some degree in her life at home. In her first 10 years of life, growing up in the 1960s, the main figures that influenced her were her two older sisters that were both twins named Renee Ann Charles and Renita Ann Charles. Ru was also the older brother of his younger sister called Rosalind Annette Charles. They all had a strong family bond with each other, especially his relationship with his two older sisters. And of course, his mom Ernestine. At the time, Ernestine was working as a college clerk, while Ru's father Irving was an electrician. At this point, it's easier for me to draw an idea of what Ru's life must have been like when she was a kid in the 60s. I feel like it's important to point out that Ru was raised during the height of the civil rights movement in the United States. For example, Ru was just 7 years old when the 1967 Detroit riots happened, an event where frustrations experienced by the Black community resulted in protests that erupted into riots, leaving dozens of people dead and thousands of buildings burned. It was a significant event that really shed more of a focus on the long road to trying to fix racial tensions in the United States. That same year, at the age of just 7 years old, RuPaul's parents divorced. As time passed, by the time he was a teenager, he went through what most people go through, which was having difficulty with the environment they were in. Ru felt trapped living at home with his family, and he didn't like his school either. I mentioned this because as we get into the 1970s, we see Ru sort of evolve her character around the idea of fighting for what you wanted. So when he turned 15, he moved to Atlanta with his older sister, who had just gotten a job working there. Atlanta is where Ru would create this sort of second home for herself, but was also already getting into the Atlanta drag scene by sneaking into the clubs and performing in drag. So picture it. It's the 1970s, the first decade after the gay rights movement began. During this time period, Ru was a teenager. Most importantly, he started to get obsessed with some of the main pop girlies at the time, such as Cher or of course Diana Diana Ross. Ru looked at these women as examples of how to draw the attention in a room. They were both entertainers, with such a uniqueness to them that is just so hard for anybody else to replicate. It was something that Ru would want to apply to her life, to one day invoke the same feeling of awe that she had experienced when she watched her role models. She'd also end up developing a huge passion for fashion that she expressed even when she was in high school too. I mean, look at her in this picture of her going to prom for her senior year. This must have been quite the moment in her high school. It's too bad there's nobody from one of his classes that have come out with stories of what Ru must have been like when she was in school. By the end of the 1970s, Ru was now a 19-year-old twink, the same age Crystal Versace was when she won Drag Race UK Season 3. A year after these pictures were taken, Ru would turn 20, and it was the start of a brand new chapter in her life. Yet coincidentally, it was also the start of the 1980s, that as we all know would go on to be one of the most difficult time periods to be part of the LGBT community, due to the AIDS crisis. Despite this, Ru really flourished during this time period because she was deep into her art form in ways that she had never been before. After living in the Atlanta drag scene for a couple of years, she later on moved to New York City. It's throughout this decade that Ru was supposedly doing several different types of drugs, which she's always been pretty open about. Like when on season 10, she mentioned how her and Lady Bunny used to take acid all the time in the 80s. And sometimes Ru would be having such a bad trip that Lady Bunny would notice and tell Ru that the devil was gonna get her. I wonder how deep Ru's friendship with Lady Bunny was. The two seem to have such a good dynamic that I wish we could have gotten to see more moments of them together doing some banter. After all, I'm not sure if Ru even still talks to Bunny, since Bunny has sort of been doing her own thing performing around the country, while Ru spends half the year just filming multiple seasons one after another. What made Ru's club kid type of drag a significant moment during this era is that most of the time there was no inspiration behind her looks, except for just trying to be experimental with her creativity. I feel like people tend to presume that Ru no longer has the same amount of love for drag that she once had, but I completely disagree with that. Even after the 90s, where Ru reached what many believe to be the peak of her career, there's countless stories by queens who've competed in the early seasons of Drag Race that they always remembered Ru coming into the local bars in Los Angeles to watch some of the queens perform, along with always tipping them to show his support, sometimes even working the spotlight to make sure that the queens on stage felt like the stars they were. Plus, Ru has always loved to take on the persona of being a guru. I mean, it was her whole brand when she was selling one of her first books. Yet, to some degree, while some people think that it's not genuine, it must be a key part of who Ru is as a person. One of the toughest lessons that it seemed RuPaul learned in her career was that nothing lasts forever. Her rise to fame was like a wish come true. Her efforts gave her opportunities to become a fixture within American pop culture, at least for a little bit. Even if her music career never necessarily took off, aside from her having a big hit with Supermodel of the World, she was like the token drag queen that would be invited to talk shows, cameo on TV shows, or just someone that many artists wanted to collaborate with in some way or form. According to Ru, she always knew that she was going to end up being famous. It was her mom that instilled this idea into her from a very young age, reminding Ru at any moment that she was very special. So you're probably imagining that Ru's mom must have been so happy for Ru's eventual newfound fame. Yet the reality of Ru's relationship with his mom would end up being bittersweet. A very heartbreaking part about Ru's story is that one of the most supportive people in her life was her mother, that believed in Ru throughout every stage of her life. But the same year that Ru got her first hit with the music video and song for Supermodel of the World, RuPaul's mom Ernestine would end up dying from a heart attack. She would never get to see Ru eventually host her own talk show, or the countless appearances on different pop culture movies and TV shows, or that in the future, Ru would literally take over the world, just like she knew she would. A couple years prior to this, Ru's mom had gotten cancer, which caused her health to plummet, eventually leading to her death. According to Ru, she's always been a very spiritual person, which stems a lot from her mom's influence. Ru says that when she was performing at a gay and lesbian march in Washington that year, by that point, she had been trying to come to terms with the fact that her mom was soon going to be dying because of how much the cancer was affecting her. That night, she remembers looking at the sun going down with a plane taking off in the distance. The next morning, she got a call from her older sister, telling her that their mom had passed away. Ru then broke down crying as the new reality of the situation set in. If you haven't watched Drag Race Season 2, on the episode that Morgan McMichaels and Sahara Davenport lip sync, they performed the song Carry On by Martha Wash. This was a song that Ru listened to constantly after her mother's death, and credits it with being a big contributor that helped her cope with the grief she experienced in the years that followed. On the other hand, hand, Ru's father Irving would actually be able to live long enough for a good portion of Ru's future successes. He'd go on to die in the year 2012, which was already 4 years into Ru's new franchise. So at least one of his parents were able to see what he'd eventually become. Most people know that Rupaul became really popular in the 90s. Her biggest peaks were obviously in 1993 with the release of the Supermodel of the World video, and in 1997 where she got her own talk show. It's surreal to look back at this era. I wish Rupaul would do more interviews where she discusses the internal struggles that she dealt with during the 90s. She was at a brand new height in her career, but with that height came a lot of homophobia from the industry. There's an episode of The View where a clip ended up going viral because Ru and the host get into it a little bit.
They did fem her up. I love the haircut.
Doesn't the hair look great?
The hair looks great, and you wearing nice colors and stuff, but the slacks, you know.
She looks fabulous.
Do you think that I'm going to take fashion advice from a drag queen?
Well, honey, my sister, you better take, listen, Joy, you better take it from somebody.
To most of society, drag queens were misfits. So for her to say something like that was not only disrespectful, but an insult to a whole group of people. That being said, Ru wasn't afraid to defend herself when she needed to. She was never the one to cower in a corner. Like, let's remember that one of the requirements to become America's next drag superstar is to have nerve, which is one of the biggest contributors that allow Ru to keep moving forward despite all the obstacles that were placed in front of her. By the time Ru began to get invited to events, there must have been many times where she was invited as a token to try to make the party see Ru as a product to laugh at rather than a person among their peers in the industry. I think this because there's a lot of queens even nowadays that have called out companies or event parties for inviting them under the guise of them getting more exposure, when really it's to have the gag of having a drag queen at your event. Like, if circumstances surrounding big companies hiring drag queens are shady in modern times, imagine how bad it must have been when Ru was pretty much the only queen in Hollywood during that point in time. While Ru did find several opportunities through the 90s that helped elevate her career in many ways, the newfound fame did have its downside. At the MTV Video Music Awards in September of 1993, he went on stage with Milton Berle, who was known for being a comedian. What was also known is that he used to dabble in drag back in the 1950s as a fun gag. The two of them were picked to present one of the awards for the night, but they both ended up throwing shady comments at each other. During the segment, Ru, who was visibly frustrated, said, quote, "So you used to wear gowns, but now you're wearing diapers," with Milton quickly replying, "Oh, so we're gonna ad-lib? I'll check my brain and we'll start even."
I used to wear gowns myself.
Is that right? You used to wear gowns, and that's funny. Now you wear diapers.
Yeah. You want to ad-lib? If you want to ad-lib, I'll check my brains. We'll start even.
Ad-libbing means to go off script. So Milton's joke was that in order for him to ad-lib as well as Rupaul, he would have to not have a brain at all, hence calling Rupaul stupid. This situation resulted in Rupaul getting a big amount of negative backlash from most of the media that was pinning Rupaul as a rude person for the interaction that happened at the VMAs. According to Ru, the reason for the awkward interaction was that the audience didn't see what was happening backstage. Apparently, before they walked out to present the MTV Awards, Milton was trying to grab Ru's ass and breast and said something to the effect of, "Are those real? Let's have a feel." Ru responded by telling him to get his hands off her, with tensions between them getting very toxic prior to going up on stage. So that's why by that point, she was still super annoyed with him and she decided to ad-lib out of impulse. Later on, Rupaul said that she sort of got over the whole situation very quickly, with the one thing that she's learned about being in the spotlight is that things will change at any moment. So the negative reaction from the public wasn't going to get her down. Despite the negativity that Ru experienced with some individuals, there was some people out there in Hollywood that genuinely liked what Ru represented in the community. Ru's friendship with Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of Nirvana, is one of my favorite bits of lore about her career. There was always such a respect between the two, and it was awesome to see both his wife and daughter later on be guests in the judges panel on Drag Race. The 90s was also a time period where it felt like to Ru, she had to gravitate towards really really emphasizing glamour in her career so that it was easier to market herself towards the general audience that didn't know anything about what drag was. Even Ru was aware that it'd be a lot easier to pander to the general audience as a fierce glamazon rather than the gender-bending version of herself that she had come to find in her early years. Ru has said that she's done many different types of drugs throughout her time as a younger drag queen, especially when she was wilding out in New York City. Some have theorized that maybe this is why Ru has issues trying to remember Queen's name sometimes. But to that I say, who cares? Ru would end up finding her sobriety in her early 30s. It was around that same time that she took the dive into becoming a mainstream entertainer with the release of her music videos. It's in a way a testament to why, to this day, RuPaul is so strongly intertwined with her own mental health or her belief in spirituality. Literally every aspect of her career started to evolve for the better when she made the decision to become sober. Yet despite finding what she thought was the height of a flourishing career in the 1990s, it all began to change. Pretty soon, her talk show had been cancelled by VH1, and the excitement surrounding the polarizing drag queen that had briefly entered American pop culture began to fade away. It must have been agonizing to have to watch your career reach unimaginable heights, only for all of a sudden, VH1 cancels your talk show as soon as you thought you finally found yourself the next big thing to do with your platform. Yet again, RuPaul learned something in the year 1998. Nothing lasts forever. Relevancy in the world doesn't last forever. Hollywood is a scam. But that didn't mean that it was the end for her. There needed to be something else that she could do once again to make herself relevant in the world. Little did she know that the long drought would end up lasting a full 10 years between the cancellation of her talk show and the release of the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race. If you didn't know, Drag Race was actually a project that was inspired by the sudden rise in reality TV competitions in the late 90s and early 2000s. And Drag Race would have actually been able to air several years prior to 2009 had it not been from being consistently rejected by multiple networks, including Logo TV that rejected the concept a couple times until finally caving in and becoming the first network for the show. Although, regardless of what would come in the future for him, there was a big period of time where RuPaul's career had kind of become irrelevant, without any big projects going on, especially for most of the 2000s decade. I like to name this period the quote, Great Rupression, which was an era where she really struggled to try to keep her name relevant. She popped a couple cameos in reality TV shows here and there, but there was no longer a big presence about her. Her charisma was still fully intact, but the looks were serving what I like to consider 2000s fashion down. Yet it's hard to really critique this individual when you see just how far she's come. Then again, whenever Ru speaks about the stresses of the entertainment industry, she points out that while it is unfair, she never felt it was a detriment to her continuing and trying to build her career. A common theme to Ru's story is that she always had nerve, which is why at the end of the 2000s, Ru had the nerve to make his own TV show after many people considered him to be an irrelevant person within pop culture, representing that despite everyone in his environment telling him that he would never be able to make a successful comeback into Hollywood, that she was now able to prove them all wrong. Yet one thing's for sure, there's a lot of untapped material out there about the details behind Ru's life, especially further back than just the 90s. I hope that maybe one day RuPaul collaborates as a writer in a live-action adaptation of his life that somehow ends up winning an Oscar. If you want to take a deeper dive into RuPaul's life, make sure to check out my video about how RuPaul changed everything. It'll be linked below. I want to take a moment to thank my patrons. In the Elite Pink Squad, we have Matthew Burns, Gay Uncle, Wendell Norris Realtor, Tyler Hendricks MD, Poppers Alberta, Sari Tish, and Natasha D. Leon. And in the Green Squad, we have Azure, Cayman Rider Furry, Franny Fishsticks, Edgar Allan Pup, O Nicole, The Only Sean, IJS, Not a Punch But a Keek, Chet Barker, and of course, Jack Beck. If you'd like to see your name on the screen, you can support me on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Twitter at GreenGayYT, and also follow my TikTok and Instagram, which I just made at It's Green Gay. And let me know what video topics you'd like to see me cover in future videos. I'll see you guys next time.